Hi, thanks for clicking and thanks for watching once again. So there's been a philosophical concept that I've stumbled across in my own thinking, in my own perceptions, which I think is highly relevant to philosophy and critical thinking and to how we interact with one another and how we deal with the things we read and the things that we hear and all these things that, as a philosophy grad student and as a teaching assistant who has taught critical thinking for 3.5 years now, I'm actually shocked to see this hasn't come up. As far as I know, I'm the one now pointing this out. So I'm not sure. Tell me otherwise if somebody else has noticed this. But the thing I want to address is what I'm going to call this the fallacy of cognitive symmetry. Okay? That's where we assume that something that, say, requires a lot of thought and cognition and requires a lot of mental effort on our part in order to understand or accomplish, requires the same amount on somebody else's part. Okay? So I'm calling this the fallacy of temporal, or of a cognitive symmetry. Right? Symmetry in the sense that we're assuming that what's going on inside of our heads is the same as what's going on inside of somebody else's head when they're doing something or saying something or believing something or behaving in a certain way or whatever. This should automatically not strike anybody as controversial as being a problem. I think we've all been in a situation where somebody was trying to teach us how to do something and they got frustrated with us because we weren't just picking it up. Because they made the mistake of assuming that because it was easy for them, that it should be easy for us. Maybe they forgot that it took them a while to pick up that skill, like driving, to take that one step further, if you're driving along and you see somebody breaking a rule of the road that to you is so obvious, and, you ask yourself, what are they thinking? Don't you know you have to do X, Y, Z when it comes to ABC? Stop sign or speed limit or get in the right lane if you're going slow or whatever. But yeah, you're making the mistake of thinking that they have subsumed and appropriated and learned the skills the same way you have. That's why we have standardized testing for driver's license and various other skills and things. It's so that everybody should be on the same page. But unfortunately, by assuming that they are on the same page, we're committing what I call this cognitive symmetry fallacy. The reason why this became so apparent to me and obvious to me is because I was doing a lot of research into synesthesia. Synesthesia is where, for some people, and this has been absolutely proven, this is not controversial, this is not some harebrained conspiracy theory thing, okay? By, cognitive scientists, neuroscientists have proven that some people have crossed senses so that what is happening in the eyes and what is happening in the ears for some of us as distinct are not distinct for some people. Where a color can elicit a taste. They see the color blue and they taste something bitter, as an example. I think the most common one is called color grapheme synesthesia, where letters and numbers immediately show up in colors to these people, to these synesthetes. And why this elicited to me an understanding of this fallacy is because people are so unwilling to acknowledge that some people have this as an immediate way of being in the world. Why is that? Why are people so unwilling to just admit that maybe other people's brains don't work the same way as your brain? Why? Why are people so unwilling to admit that? It's due to this fallacy. Because when I have to explain to you what synesthesia is, it requires a lot of effort probably on most people's parts to understand what I'm saying. How can it be that Tuesday tastes like macaroni? I think that's somebody in one of my classes that had synesthesia when she was younger, and it was bred out of her, probably thanks to this fallacy. You know, days had tastes, certain words had flavors. And personally, when I was very young, words had shapes that would show up in my mind. That's been bred out of me, you know, thanks to the society that we live in that just can't accept that other people have immediate ways of cognitively interacting with the world that are simple and fast and immediate, even though other people don't have that. Because the majority of people do not have synesthesia in adult life. Anyways, it's bred out of us because of this fallacy. It's not normal for you to do X, Y, and Z in order to interact with the world. So stop doing it. Which is totally ignorant of the fact that they weren't doing X, Y, and Z in order to be that way in the world. They were just being that way in the world. And, you know, this relates to what I also call a temporal fallacy, or the fallacy of temporal supremacy. That's another video. But there were ways of being in the world just 50 years ago, right, that are like totally cognitively different in the amount of thought that must go into that being and in the quality of thought that must go into that being in the world. Like swinging an axe. Okay, this is why I'm a philosopher and I make philosophical videos, but I also make bushcrafting videos because I see that there is something important and relevant about tool use. Well, you can see in the background, I love tools, and I think being able to use tools is a important thing, to the point where I think you should be able to pick a tool up and train yourself so that there's not much going on inside of your head in order to be able to use that tool. Right? But when I interact with philosophers, I mean grad students, I mean upper middle class white Canadians, you know, I get this thing, why do you have an axe? Why do you They see an axe and they think something I don't understand, something I don't really know how to pick up and use. So when I have to explain why I have an axe and how to use it, that's a lot of effort on their part in order to understand what I'm saying. And it's just not worth it to them. And it's painful, and they're just neglecting the fact that, for me, the quality and amount, for any of us who use a sword, like I was on the fencing team for a while, so I can talk about this, but for any of us who know how to use a sword, who are interested in learning and then just subsuming and understanding how to use a sword, how to use an axe, how to use a screwdriver, a drill, tools, people who live a certain lifestyle, and this is very common in the West, just don't see any importance to that, and it takes a lot of effort on their part mentally in order to understand why anybody would use those things and how they could use those things. And because it takes all this extra effort on their part, this taints it as being something not really worth doing, and they assume that that's true for you too. They're assuming that what's going on inside of their heads is symmetrical with what's going on inside of your head as a tool user in this example. This can be applied to so many things. Okay, as a philosophy graduate student, I so often encounter this happening in academic journals. Whether it's that temporal fallacy, how could the ancients have thought that Saturday was black? That relates back to synesthesia too, but, you know, a couple hundred years ago, there was this notion of sympathy and antipathy, and this was a kind of natural way of understanding the world. If a couple different things were black, like a flower was black and a mushroom was black, and our understanding of the planet Saturn was black for some reason, and it was, then these things have a sympathy with each other. And this is somehow natural and understandable for, like, medieval man. Right? Or war, and the color red, and the god Tyr, the Viking god Tyr. All of these things had some connection They're all about war and aggression. If you're a poetically minded person, even today, that kind of makes sense to you. Red is the color of blood, so red would be the color of war, and if Tyr is the god of war, and by the way, that's where Tuesday, that's where the name of the third day of the week comes from, Tuesday. So Tuesday is red. That is just something that makes sense to certain people and would have made a lot more sense, a lot more readily to people a couple hundred years ago. But modern day thinkers and the so-called academics and intelligentsia, they're just like, why? It's very frustrating because you're assuming that because something seems silly to you because of what you have to do in your brain in order to understand it, that it is silly, objectively speaking. Okay, it's not. You're committing a fallacy of cognitive symmetry, believing that what goes on in your brain is somehow symmetrical with what goes on in somebody else's brain who believes something that doesn't make sense to you. Doesn't make sense to me, so it doesn't actually make sense. Guess what? It makes sense to me. Because I have a different way of being in the world. What's going on inside of my head is not symmetrical with what's going on inside of your head. There's so many countless examples of this that it's shocking to me that nobody has put a name, as far as I know, on this fallacy. What I'm calling the fallacy of cognitive symmetry. Another example is, and I want to make a video about this, I already kind of made a video talking about the goth thing and tool use combined together, actually. But being a goth entails dressing a certain way, which is a function of being a certain way and not vice versa, okay? If you're doing it legitimately. But because I'm going to actually have to make an entire video about what it means to be a goth, I understand already that it's going to take a lot of effort on a lot of non-goths' parts to understand what being a goth is. And because it takes a lot of effort, and because it seems convoluted and strange to them, which it really shouldn't, especially when it comes to goth, they're going to dismiss it as something that's silly and just... Like with a lot of fashion and music-oriented movements, the fashion and the music is arising out of a way of being. The fashion and the music is not some artificial constructed thing, or it shouldn't be, anyways. And you only make the assumption that it's artificial and constructed because you have to artificially construct it in your own brain in order to understand how it happens in somebody else. And that's a fallacious thing to do. What I'm saying is, while you have to put effort into understanding why people do things and behave in certain ways and just believe certain things, while you may have to put effort into understanding all that, it doesn't mean that they did. For them, it might be natural. It might be a function and an artifact of their being in the world as they are. I guess as I talk about it more and more, I see how it's difficult for people to pick up on it. But if you do, I think it becomes clear how insidious and how common a thing it actually is. I mean, it's a problem for me because I've recognized it so often that when I just bring it up in a philosophical paper that I'm writing, then the professor who's marking my paper, or whoever's reading it, says, What are you saying here? What? So I'm making this video to try to just put it on the table, and hopefully... Can you really refute this, though? I mean, I was going to say put it on the table so people can discuss whether or not it's actually happening. Can you refute this? I mean, come on, all of us frequently see other people and ask ourselves, what the hell are they thinking? Maybe they're not thinking. Maybe that thing that they're doing that made you ask that is just so natural to them that there's no thinking going on, and it's just you imagining that there must be some convoluted or complicated or weird or strange or off-kilter thought process going on. That's an artifact of your own perceptions, not of what's actually going on inside of them. We don't have deep personal access to other people and what's going on inside of their brain. When we attempt to, that may require us to do a lot of work on our own part, but that does not then mean that they have done a lot of work in order to be that way. We're making the mistake of thinking that people are mirrors on some deep personal inner level. That's the video that relates to the video I actually wanted to make this morning, but I kept on having technical problems, so I didn't. But really, this has been something on my mind for a long time, and I would love to hear people's thoughts on it. There's so many other instances. There's just countless. Oh God, race issues. What did I want to say about that? When a white person has to put a lot of effort into understanding what the black or colored experience is, whether you're racist or liberal on both sides of the spectrum, when a white upper class person or middle upper class or middle class person puts certain effort into understanding what it means to be a black or colored minority lower class person, and then they come to some sort of grand unifying theory about what it means to be either racist or a liberal, either way, you then assume that that's kind of what's going on inside of the head of the people that you're talking about. It's a fallacy of cognitive symmetry. Okay. That might be a bit hard to follow, the point I'm making there. I'm going to have to make another video about that. But I mean, this springs from the fact that with a lot of the racially characterized stuff going on in the media recently, this is why I left Facebook. I see a lot of middle class and upper middle class white people talking about black people as if they are somehow privy to and somehow connected to with what's going on inside of the minds of colored people and black people of a totally different socioeconomic class. How can you say that? I mean, it's like this has happened twice in my life where a white person took issue with the fact that I refer to myself as colored. Pardon me, but what business is it of yours? Yeah, because when they hear somebody saying that word, in their mind, what's going on? That's a racially charged term. That term elicits ideas of repression and the KKK and colored. Oh, you can't say colored. Or Negro. Negro is another one that's just drives people crazy. White people. I got news for you. For some of us non-white people, and for some black people, colored and Negro don't elicit all of that stuff that you have going on inside of your head. You're making an assumption. You are just falling into this fallacy of cognitive symmetry. Oh, I could never call a colored person colored. I could never call it whatever you white people say. I could never call that person colored. I could never call that person Negro. And now you're assuming that I can't call myself colored? You're assuming that a black person can't call themselves Negro? That's not your call to make. What's going on inside of your head is not symmetrical with another person's cognition. That's a fallacious thing to assume. All right? I could just keep going on and on and on about this, and there's far more academic avenues I could go down in talking about my research into phenomenology, into language, into mathematics, into the occult, into historical aspects of science and philosophy. But I hope I've characterized it in such a way that just, normal, down-to-earth people can see. When you see somebody doing something or behaving a certain way or just dressed a certain way and it doesn't make sense to you, don't assume it doesn't make sense to them. When somebody describes a certain way of being in the world that requires you to do a lot of work in your brain in order to understand it, don't assume that there's a lot of work going on their part in order to trick you into thinking that that's something that's normal to them. Do not assume cognitive symmetry.